Picture this. A 9-year-old boy, abandoned on the frozen steppes of Mongolia, watching his father's killers ride away into the endless horizon. That boy would grow up to become the most feared name in human history. He was a nomadic warrior who rose from nothing to build the largest land empire the world has ever seen. An empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe. But was Genghis Khan just a savage conqueror driven by bloodlust, or a visionary genius who fundamentally reshaped civilization itself? Today, we're diving deep into the life of a man who started as an outcast and became the ruler of over 100 million people. This is UTAK Diaries, where history comes alive. Hit that like and subscribe button, because we're about to ride into the storm of one of history's most controversial figures. The year was around 1162, and the Mongolian steppes were a brutal place, where survival depended on strength, cunning, and the ability to adapt faster than your enemies could strike. Into this unforgiving world was born a boy named Temujin, a name that would eventually become synonymous with terror across 3 continents. His father, Yasuge, was a tribal chief of the Borjigin clan, a man who commanded respect through both diplomacy and violence. But respect meant nothing when poison found its way into your cup. When Temujin was just 9 years old, his father was murdered by members of the rival Tota tribe, the same people who had been his father's enemies for generations. The method was as old as the steppes themselves. They invited Yasuge to a feast and laced his food with poison. With their leader dead, the Borjigin clan's fortunes collapsed overnight. Temujin's family, his mother Holan, his siblings, and their few remaining followers, were cast out into the wilderness. They were left to survive on their own, in a landscape that showed no mercy to the weak. Picture a single mother with young children, abandoned in conditions that would challenge experienced hunters. They ate roots, berries, and whatever small game they could catch. Some days, they ate nothing at all. But Holan was no ordinary woman. She had been kidnapped by Yasuge from another tribe, a common practice that forged both alliances and blood feuds. Now, she became the backbone of her family's survival, teaching her children that in a world where everyone was an enemy, they could only trust each other. She instilled in young Temujin a lesson that would define his entire life. Loyalty was everything, and betrayal was the ultimate sin. The harsh steppes became Temujin's university. He learned to read the weather in cloud formations, to find water where others saw only barren land, and to understand that in the game of survival, mercy was a luxury that could get you killed. He discovered that horses weren't just transportation. They were partners, weapons, and sometimes the difference between life and death. As a teenager, this lesson in ruthlessness reached its breaking point. During a fishing expedition, Temujin and his half-brother Bekta got into a dispute over a fish and a lark that Temujin had caught. It might seem trivial, but in a family living on the edge of starvation, every piece of food mattered. The argument escalated, and in a moment that would haunt and define him, Temujin killed his half-brother with an arrow. His mother was horrified, calling him a destroyer of his own family. But Temujin had learned a terrible truth. In his world, there was no room for internal division. Unity meant survival, and anyone who threatened that unity, even family, was a threat to everyone's existence. From this chaos and brutality, something extraordinary began to emerge. Temujin started forming alliances, one clan at a time. But he offered something revolutionary, a new kind of leadership based on merit rather than bloodline. If you were skilled, if you were loyal, if you could contribute to the group's survival and success, you could rise in his ranks regardless of your birth. This was radical thinking in a society built on rigid tribal hierarchy. Traditional Mongol leaders inherited their positions and surrounded themselves with relatives and old allies Temujin promoted based on ability and loyalty alone. Former enemies who proved their worth could become his most trusted generals. This meritocratic approach would become one of the defining features of his later empire. By his 20s, Temujin wasn't just another tribal warrior scraping by on the steppes. He was becoming a force of nature, a rising storm that would soon reshape the world. People began to notice the young man who had survived abandonment, murder, and betrayal to emerge stronger than ever. By 1206, after decades of warfare, political maneuvering, and strategic alliances, Temujin had accomplished what many thought impossible. He had unified the fractured Mongol tribes under a single banner. At a great assembly called a Kurotai, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, a title that meant universal ruler or ruler of all. But Genghis Khan wasn't content with just unifying the Mongols. He completely revolutionized their entire social and military structure, creating innovations that would influence warfare and governance for centuries to come. His military reforms were nothing short of revolutionary. He organized his army using a decimal system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 called tumen. This created a clear chain of command and made his forces incredibly flexible and responsive. But more importantly, he shattered the old tribal system by deliberately mixing warriors from different clans within the same units. This meant that soldiers' primary loyalty was to their unit and ultimately to Genghis Khan himself, not to their birth tribe. He promoted soldiers based purely on loyalty and skill, creating a true meritocracy. Some of his greatest generals were former enemies who had proven their worth in battle. Gib, one of his most trusted commanders, had literally shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him during a battle. Instead of executing him, Genghis Khan was so impressed by his honesty about the deed that he promoted him to general. Genghis Khan also established one of history's most effective intelligence networks. His merchants, diplomats, and spies gathered information from across Asia, giving him detailed knowledge of enemy territories, political situations, and military capabilities long before his armies arrived. This intelligence network was so sophisticated that it would make modern spy agencies envious. Perhaps most surprisingly for his time, he embraced religious tolerance. Unlike many conquerors who imposed their beliefs on conquered peoples, Genghis Khan allowed freedom of worship throughout his empire. He consulted with Christian priests, Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Taoist philosophers. This wasn't just pragmatic politics. It was a revolutionary approach to governance that helped stabilize his diverse empire. He established a legal code called the Yasa, which created consistent laws across his territories. The Yasa covered everything from military organization to trade regulations, from marriage customs to punishment for crimes. It was one of the first attempts to create a universal legal framework that could govern diverse populations across vast distances. But make no mistake, despite these progressive innovations, his military campaigns were absolutely brutal. His army was lightning fast, covering distances that seemed impossible to his enemies. They were terrifyingly disciplined, capable of complex maneuvers that required split-second timing and absolute trust between units. The Mongols perfected psychological warfare as an art form. They used fake retreats to lure enemies into traps, employed superior mobility to attack from unexpected directions, and spread stories of their own cruelty to terrorize populations before they even arrived. They would sometimes spare one city completely, while utterly destroying its neighbor, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that made resistance seem futile. When cities resisted, the destruction was total and systematic. Every building was demolished, every person killed, and the land was sometimes even salted to prevent regrowth. But if a city surrendered without a fight, Genghis Khan often spared the population and absorbed their skills, knowledge, and crafts into his growing empire. He understood that fear was not just a byproduct of conquest, it was a weapon as powerful as any sword or arrow. Cities that heard stories of Mongol brutality would often surrender without a fight, saving both sides the cost of battle. This psychological approach to warfare would become a defining characteristic of Mongol military strategy. With Mongolia unified under his rule, Genghis Khan turned his hungry gaze outward. The steppes had forged him into a conqueror, but the settled civilizations surrounding his homeland would test whether his innovations could work on a truly massive scale. His first major target was the Western Xia dynasty in northern China. This kingdom controlled crucial trade routes and had grown wealthy from Silk Road commerce. The Xia rulers initially agreed to pay tribute, but when they later refused to provide military support for his campaigns, Genghis Khan returned with devastating force. The campaign against Western Xia became a testing ground for Mongol siege warfare techniques and their ability to adapt to fighting in settled, agricultural regions rather than the open steppes. Next came the Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China and represented one of the most sophisticated military and administrative systems in the world. The Jin had powerful fortifications, advanced siege engines, and armies that outnumbered the Mongols by enormous margins. But Genghis Khan had learned to turn his enemies' strengths against them. He recruited Chinese engineers who taught his forces how to build and operate siege equipment. He used Chinese administrators who understood how to govern large populations. Most importantly, he exploited the Jin dynasty's internal divisions and rebellions. The siege of Zhongdu demonstrated the evolution of Mongol warfare. Instead of simply surrounding the city and waiting, Genghis Khan systematically destroyed the surrounding countryside, cutting off food supplies and forcing the population to consume their reserves. When the city finally fell, it was through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic manipulation, and the simple fact that the defenders had run out of options. But it was his campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire that truly demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of Mongol military might. The Khwarezmian Shah controlled a vast territory that included parts of modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. The conflict began not with military ambition, but with a disastrous diplomatic mistake. Genghis Khan had sent a trade caravan of 450 merchants to establish commercial relations with the Khwarezmian Empire. These weren't just traders. They were also diplomats, carrying offers of peaceful trade and mutual prosperity. But the governor of Otrar, a border city, accused the merchants of being spies and had them executed. When Genghis Khan sent 3 ambassadors to demand justice, the Shah killed one and sent the other 2 back with their beards shaved off, a profound insult in their culture. This was perhaps the most catastrophic diplomatic blunder in human history. The Shah had just declared war on the most formidable military force in the world, over what should have been a routine trade dispute. Genghis Khan's response was swift and absolutely devastating. He personally led an army of approximately 200,000 warriors westward, while his generals led additional forces that attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The Mongols didn't just defeat the Khwarezm armies. They systematically obliterated every trace of the empire's existence. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench were completely destroyed. Bukhara, one of the great centers of Islamic learning and culture, was burned to the ground. Genghis Khan reportedly stood in the city's main mosque and declared to the assembled population that he was the punishment of God for their sins. Samarkand, which had been one of the jewels of the Silk Road, was so thoroughly destroyed that it took centuries to recover. The numbers from this campaign are staggering and almost incomprehensible. Historical accounts suggest that entire populations were eliminated. Not just the armies, but every man, woman, and child in some cities. Modern historians debate these numbers, but even conservative estimates suggest that millions died during the Mongol conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire. Yet even in this campaign of unprecedented destruction, Genghis Khan's strategic vision was apparent. He didn't just destroy, he also preserved what was useful. Skilled craftsmen, engineers, and administrators were spared and relocated to other parts of his empire. Libraries and schools were sometimes preserved if they surrendered peacefully. The Mongols were building something new from the ashes of the old world. The campaign also demonstrated the Mongols' incredible adaptability. They learned to conduct siege warfare in desert conditions, to govern agricultural populations, and to manage supply lines across thousands of miles. They incorporated local military techniques and technologies, making their armies stronger with each conquest. By the time the Khwarezmian Empire was completely destroyed, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. No land empire in human history had ever controlled such a vast territory. But more than just the size, it was the speed of this expansion that astonished the world. In just a few decades, Genghis Khan had conquered territory that would take a modern army months to cross. This wasn't just military conquest, it was the creation of a new world order. The Mongols connected east and west in ways that had never existed before. Silk Road trade flourished under their protection. Paper money, diplomatic immunity, and even passport systems expanded under Mongol rule. They created the first truly international communication system, with relay stations that allowed messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other in record time. In 1227, at the height of his power, Genghis Khan died under circumstances that remain one of history's greatest mysteries. Some accounts say he fell from his horse during a hunting expedition. Others claim he was killed in battle against the Western Shia, who had rebelled against Mongol rule. More dramatic versions suggest he was killed by a captured enemy princess, who concealed a weapon during what was meant to be a night of victory celebration. The truth is that we may never know exactly how the world's greatest conqueror died. What we do know is that his death was kept secret for months to prevent rebellions across his vast empire. According to Mongol custom, everyone who witnessed his funeral procession was killed to preserve the secret of his burial location. To this day, despite numerous archaeological expeditions and even satellite surveys, Genghis Khan's grave remains undiscovered. But his physical death marked only the beginning of his true legacy. He had fathered hundreds of children with wives and concubines from across his empire. Modern genetic studies suggest that approximately 1 in 200 men alive today, roughly 16 million people, may be direct descendants of Genghis Khan. His genetic legacy literally spans continents and cultures. More importantly, his empire continued to expand under his sons and grandsons. His third son, Genghis Khan, completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty and launched invasions into Europe that reached as far as Poland and Hungary. His grandson, Genghis Khan, consolidated Mongol power and prepared for even greater conquests. His most famous grandson founded China's Yuan dynasty and ruled over one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. Under Mongol rule, the world became connected in unprecedented ways. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, created safe passage for merchants, scholars, and travelers across the entire breadth of Asia. Technologies, ideas, and innovations flowed freely between civilizations that had previously been isolated from each other. The Mongols facilitated the spread of gunpowder from China to Europe. They promoted religious tolerance and cultural exchange. They established the first international postal system. They created standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade across vast distances. They even promoted the status of women in ways that were revolutionary for their time. Mongol women could own property, engage in business, and sometimes even lead military campaigns. But perhaps, most significantly, the Mongol Empire created the conditions that would eventually lead to the European age of exploration. By connecting East and West, they introduced Europeans to Asian goods, technologies, and ideas. When the Mongol Empire eventually fragmented, European merchants and explorers began searching for new routes to Asia, leading directly to the voyages of Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and other explorers, who would reshape the world yet again. The question that haunts historians is whether Genghis Khan was ultimately a force for progress or destruction. The numbers are staggering. Some estimates suggest that his conquests resulted in the deaths of 40 million people, roughly 11% of the world's population at the time. Entire civilizations were wiped from the map. Cities that had stood for millennia were reduced to rubble and never rebuilt. Yet the same conquests that brought unprecedented destruction also brought unprecedented connection. The Mongol Empire facilitated the greatest exchange of knowledge, technology, and culture in human history up to that point. They created legal systems that protected merchants and travelers. They promoted religious tolerance and cultural diversity. They established communication networks that connected disparate civilizations. Modern historians increasingly view Genghis Khan not just as a conqueror, but as one of history's most effective leaders and innovators. His military strategies are still studied in military academies around the world. His administrative innovations influenced governance systems for centuries. His approach to meritocracy and religious tolerance was centuries ahead of his time. He began as an abandoned child on the Mongolian steppes, survived betrayal and hardship that would have destroyed most people, and rose to become the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. He didn't just conquer territory. He rewired the fundamental structure of civilization itself. From outcast to emperor, from nomad to world changer, Genghis Khan's story is one of the most extraordinary rises to power in human history. He built his empire through a combination of ruthless pragmatism, innovative thinking, and sheer force of will. But his legacy raises fundamental questions about the nature of leadership, the cost of progress, and the complex relationship between destruction and creation. Was he a bloodthirsty tyrant who left a trail of bodies across 3 continents? Was he a visionary genius who connected civilizations and created the foundation for the modern world? Or was he something more complex, a product of his harsh environment, who used the tools available to him to build something unprecedented? History isn't boring. You've just never heard it told like this. Welcome to UTAK Diaries, where every fact feels like a plot twist.